Alright, and welcome back to Don't Think Just Paint. Something a little bit different today. As you may have noticed, I haven't been uploading for a couple of weeks. Basically, things have just gone completely mad. We had a cancer diagnosis in the family, so we've been dealing with that amongst other kind of illness, fairly serious illness related issues. On top of that, I've been working 2 jobs because a few reasons, but one of them being I wanted to stay flexible for the channel, but then the hours went mad and I've been completely burnt out, so I just haven't been doing anything anyway, so not ideal, to be honest. But what we're going to do is I'm going to occasionally do one of these Supercut videos where I kind of just put together a load of videos with the same theme, and it should be good for me because it's quite easy to do, but also good for you because as someone who puts on these videos while I paint, it can be annoying to like either leave autoplay or sometimes it goes on to something else you don't really want to have, so you have to like go and then interrupt your painting to choose what you're going to put on. So hopefully with this you can just kind of have it on for an hour, however long it ends up being, and that is pretty good. So if you wanted to help out and kind of make it so I don't have to keep working 2 jobs while I'm doing this, we do actually have memberships on the channel now. So we have Patreon, Coffee, all those kind of things, so you can tip, you can support long term at whatever level suits you. But YouTube membership's probably a nice easy way to do that. It'll just give me a bit of an incentive to keep going and support the channel and help us grow and all that. And while we're talking about that, memberships are quite new, and what would you like if you join the membership? Like, we can do prize draws for some of the minis I paint, you can help me choose some of the color schemes, like what would you like to see? Maybe membership requests for particular styles of tutorial, anything like that really. So in this kind of early stage of monetization, like anything like that is kind of welcome as a suggestion, and we'll see what we can do with this community really. If you don't have the spare money, totally understand, there's no pressure for that, but you can help me in other ways by just, you know, sharing, liking, all that stuff, and also just leave this on, help me get my watch hours up. This will be like a long bit of footage that you can just put on while you paint, while you do anything else, and yeah, just help me that way. Everything is massively appreciated. That all being said, hopefully you guys are doing well. Enjoy this. This is the supercut of the Eldar and Dark Eldar painting stuff. All my bright, vibrant yellows and pinks and all those crazy crystal colours there. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you for watching. About 8 or 9 years ago, I moved and had to put some stuff into storage. At the time, I was completely bored of 6th and 7th edition 40k, so I was happy to put a lot of my minis in. I hadn't thought about that in a while, but I just had a chance to go and sort through it, and let me tell you, I had so much more Warhammer than I thought. I've always been more of a work to live kind of person than a live to work kind of person, so I was pretty poor in my 20s. I don't regret that, I had a blast. However, I've just found out the main reason I was so poor. Why did I buy so much Warhammer? 9 Dark Eldar vehicles? Will I use them all in one game? Doesn't matter, got them. I quite like Tau. Hey, guess what? Now I have loads of tanks and Forge World battle suits. What's in this box? Imperial Guard tanks? I don't remember what was going on that I wanted that, being a Xenos lover. Anyway, a deep dive into my hoarding psyche aside, I have a load of Drukhari that I haven't seen since they were still called Dark Eldar. I have a new paint scheme now, and a lot of these weren't finished in the first place, so I need to bring them up to my modern standard. There's enough here that it could end up quite overwhelming if I tried to do it all at once, so I think my best way to start is to focus on the new combat patrol lists, get a simple army I can play my first few games with, and then build on that. First off, I had to strip the minis. They were previously a basic dark green scheme, but I think they have a bright future, if you know what I mean. I filled a Tupperware tub full of isopropyl alcohol. If you're trying to get hold of this, sometimes it's called IPA, sometimes isopropanol. They're all basically the same thing, just 99% alcohol. So I threw in the first batch of minis. After about 20 minutes, you can start with a pipe cleaner, toothbrush, or like a firm paintbrush, and start kind of just scrubbing the paint off. Once the majority is done and you're getting some resistance on the remaining paint, you can put them back in and leave them a bit longer. It'll loosen up the rest and just rinse and repeat until they're done. At this point, I also noticed my incubi were a pale grey, and it hit me. These models are fine cast. Of course, this collection is way before the plastic kit came out. Do you remember that stuff? Just what a fail. The minis have these weird edges and the bits are all kind of curled over. I just can't. The Incubi are getting a basic paint job and they will be the first modern kit I buy once I've got through the mountain of old stuff. My Archon didn't survive the time in storage, so I needed to get a new one. I was considering the current Archon, but I'm not that sure on it. The pose kind of looks to me like he's kind of about to do a trust fall or something. So I returned to my trusty 3D printer. I bet you are wondering if I'd get through a whole video without that thing. And I found a mini I quite liked. The posing is a little static for my taste, so I may make a new one at some point. But this is actually a really good sculpt other than that. I especially like the cool helmet with the kind of skull in between the horns. Now, for the first time ever, I decided to paint the minis separately from the bases, as I wanted to try a kind of cool effect, which we'll get to later. So, while in the repair stage of the project, I pried everyone off their bases and, you guessed it, got to 3D printing some more. To enable me to hold the minis while painting them, I pinned the feet by drilling a hole and supergluing a bit of paperclip in it. I then stuck this into cork as a painting handle. The only issue is I had about 7 corks and 16 dudes. I planned to keep switching them over, putting the ones I was actively painting into corks, but this lasted about 3 switches until I just decided to hold the unlucky ones at the feet. Finally, onto the painting, and I started by priming white and then base coating with Game Air Squid Pink. Now don't worry, I don't plan on painting all versions of my space elves in bright pinks. There's a technique I've been wanting to try for a while with a different bright colour. So once all the minis were mostly pink, I gave them a zenithal with Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White by putting it in the airbrush and selectively spraying from mostly upward angles. I tried to make sure I got more of the mini white with this step than I typically would, but still leaving the pink to act as the downward facing shading. I wanted to deepen what would become the shadows, so I used model colour fluorescent magenta and hit each model from a fully downward angle, beefing up those darker areas. At last I moved on to my main colour, Citadel Aeldar Yellow. Because of cool colour theory,
but my mom says I'm cool,
magenta actually mixes very well with yellow to make vibrant shadows. My first few models were done with the contrast thinned with contrast medium. However, as I went on I realised the colours still mixed with neat Aeldar yellow. So if you try this, don't bother thinning. I ended up going back over the first few models to bring them up anyway. For vehicles I use the airbrush. Contrast paints are notoriously bad for covering large flat surfaces evenly, so this seemed like the simplest way to do it. Contrast paints are actually really nice through an airbrush anyway. Give it a try if you haven't. My secondary colour for these models will be a dark red, so for this I used Citadel Flesh Tearers Red Contrast. I was careful to avoid the already painted areas and just coloured all the soft, non-armoury parts of the main clothing. Because these incubi, these mere fine-cast plebs, don't deserve our attention, I rushed through their helmets with Citadel Black Templar contrast. I'll highlight these up eventually, but anything to save times on these guys is worth it. The leader is supposed to have a double sword, but I guess this set didn't come with that, so I differentiate this one by just painting it with Flesh Tearers Red again. While filling out the black details, I used a regular black to block out all the weapons and little belt parts that were going to be black, along with a lot of the kind of structural bits on the raiders. Next I use Fantasy and Games Mayhem Red to block out the sails. This is pretty close to the Flesh Tearers Red, so it should match well, especially once I've done my shading. I then based the metallic parts with Hashut Copper. This was mostly on the weapons, but I included some of the small spiky details and little accessories on the belt. Now I just needed to sort out the vehicles. Because I'd used the airbrush, there was an even coverage over all of the vehicles with nothing kind of settling in the recesses, so I didn't have any natural shading. So I took Citadel Cassandora Yellow, washing the dudes as usual, then panel lining the main vehicle. Panel lining, or pin washing, is where you use a shade only in the parts you want it, so as not to darken or tint any of the main surfaces. Side note, I should have done this in a sub-assembly because there were some hard to reach parts in these vehicles. You can't really blame my impatience for that like you normally could, because leaving these models apart for 9 years in a second paint job would probably be a bit too patient. I then washed the bronze colour with Agrax Earthshade. This is quite a desaturated colour, but I felt the metallic parts didn't need to be at all bright as the rest of the mini had that job. Now the tertiary colour is a purple, so I used Army Painter Alien Purple. The colour is only meant to act as an accent on most of the minis, and maybe used a bit more liberally on higher ranking soldiers and leaders and that kind of thing. So I painted any of the small cloth bits and hair scrunchies on the warriors, and the tabards on the incubi. I used Citadel Nuln Oil to shade the skin on the one guy. This is pure black, so you wouldn't normally use this for a skin tone, but I thought I'd make their skin and hair super monotone. Maybe that's why they use the bright armour, to deflect from the fact that they're all kind of hollow and stuff like that. Now, to block in another smaller colour, I used Citadel Ushabti Bone on the, you guessed it, bone parts. All those little bits in the skin tabards and a couple of bits in their hair. So next I decided to look at the sails. They were still quite bright red and I wanted them to be quite a lot darker. I decided to do a gradient down to quite a dark black to make them look really contrasty and, you know, like magical. These are flying boats, they're not just regular sails, are they? So on my wet palette I went back to my original Mayhem red and mixed in like a gradient down to black. So my wet palette I had like the entire range of colours. I just took various gradients of these and layered them up down to a black. I would have just glazed here to smooth out the transitions, but I ended up with a weird rough texture on some of these. It's either because the spray paint was out of use and had some dried bits in the thing, or because I didn't clean off the old flecks of paint well enough. Either way, lesson learned for next time, because it was a bit of a pain in the arse at this stage. So I basically just kept mixing around and going over and over until I had a really smooth gradient. Now, I wanted to get all the main yellow armour basically done so that I could check that the weathering I wanted to do would work out quite nicely before going through everything else. A quick note about this, I did this part right at the start here because I wanted to do if I'd need to do any edge highlighting and avoid wasting time highlighting the bits that would be covered anyway. However, in the future I'm going to change this to be right at the end, because if I want to put any decals on the main body I'll need to scratch those underneath the weathering as well. Anyway, I used Citadel Rhinox hide and chopped up a sponge. I used a cable tie to keep tweezers clamped and then dabbed it lightly in the paint. I dabbed most of it off so I was getting only patchy, dotty little patterns, and then stippled unevenly across the edges of panels and the parts sticking out. I want the vehicles to be really weathered, so I went to town on this. Now, these vehicles are made to be fast and destructive, and as such, I wanted to give the impression that they've been tearing through a battlefield, through debris and bullets and whatever else. I had an idea that kind of worked out. I chopped an old brush unevenly, you know, like the way the barber does where they cut kind of perpendicular to your hair so that it kind of looks more natural and not like it's a straight line that's just been cut. You know what I'm talking about. Then I wetted the brush and took a lighter to the remaining bristles. I was trying to get them to curl up and cause a really random pattern. It did kind of harden up the bristles and cause them to just not take as much paint in, but it kind of worked. At least it gave me a scratchy texture. That was fine, really. I swiped it across the front and side facing areas, the parts that would have been ploughing through the random battlefield crap. After this stage was done, I used Game Colour Silver to mark out the areas where the damage might have got down to the base metal. With a smallish brush, I filled in the larger areas of brown, leaving it as an outline to the silver. I also used it as a sort of edge highlight for any brown areas. I did this on both types of damage, the stippled dotty stuff and the long swipey stuff. I decided to also do some regular edge highlighting to further define panels and armour edges where there wasn't any damage. I mixed model colour golden yellow and bold titanium white 50-50 and did this in a really scratchy, uneven way to further push the idea of minor scrapes amongst the big damage. I don't like edge highlighting, so 16 dudes and 2 vehicles was trying. Once it was finally done, I added to my pain by putting even more white in the mix and going over any corners or where scratches hit the edge of the panels. This was a bit less tedious because there was less to do and definitely pushed the effect into looking really awesome. I hate edge highlighting, but I can't deny its efficacy. So that's the armour fully done and the majority of the edge highlighting out of the way. Next I focused on the bronze, going back to Hashut copper to re-establish the base tone. I painted direct from the pot as this was another part that had gained that rough texture, and I was hoping I could kind of cover that up with thicker paint. Using undiluted paint to smooth over details is a technique normally known in the industry as fucking up. I painted this everywhere except the recesses, leaving the shade in those areas. I then added some game colour silver, about 2 parts copper to 1 part silver, and went over a large portion of these areas. I was starting to feel that the bronze was too similar in tone to the orangey yellows, and it was getting a bit lost, so I decided I wanted to make it a fair bit paler. I hoped this would make it stand out more and add some more visual interest. So therefore I made sure to take the majority of these parts into this more silvery brassy colour. I used a brush carefully for the flat or smooth round surfaces, but gave a quick dry brush to any chains or areas that had some nice detail sculpted. Finally, I made a mix of mostly silver with just a small amount of the copper and highlighted the edges and the upward facing areas. With the yellow and brass done, I moved on to the black parts. I used Mechanica Standard Grey, which, by the way, was one of the things in storage. It's crazy how paints just last. I thought everything would be dry in that box. Anyway, I started with a quick dry brush on the Incubi helmets, because never mind those guys. I then edge highlighted all the weapons and black parts of the vehicles. After this I took model colour medium sea grey to bring the very edges and corners to a lighter tone, just finishing off that edge highlighting for those, and also a little bit of dry brushing on the Incubi. I washed the bone parts with Agrax Earthshade, used Null Oil to shade down the red to a tone I was more happy with, and then used Drakenhof Nightshade to shade all the purple parts. I next focused on the purple, re-establishing the basic tone with Alien Purple. I highlighted this with a 50-50 mix of purple and golden yellow, tying the highlights into the main tone. I highlighted the bone parts with Game Colour Bone White, using the paint very slightly watered down and running the brush towards the area I wanted, usually the ends, to create a simple gradient. Then I highlighted the red areas sparingly with Game Colour Bloody Red. This was mostly just an edge highlight as I had the main tones where I wanted them, just needed them to get a bit of definition. Okay, there were a few details left over and my patience was waning fast. With an overall army paint job such as this, those smaller details really won't be looked at particularly closely, so I decided to save my time and sanity and just gave them a very quick pass with Citadel Gore Gruntifer contrast. For the guy with his face out, I washed it with a Citadel Bealtan Green so it would look fully unnatural, then I highlighted that up with white. I finished off with the eyes and decided to try something different. Most eyes I do, I'll kind of spill the paint to the surrounding surfaces to give a glow effect, but this time I simply filled the socket with Drakenhof Nightshade, highlighted with a bit of Alien Purple, then gave a reflective dot with the white. I wanted to see how these would look as kind of simple, quite dark, just glass lenses, as the rest of the model was so bright, and I think it actually worked really well. As one last touch, I put a sigil on the Raider. It's a symbol I just quickly designed for my custom Cabal, which I'll maybe spend some more time on later on. I didn't want to spend too much time on this mass painting, so I only did one on each vehicle. With that part done, I'm calling this project finished for now, ready to go out and pillage real space. So this is the end result, a full combat patrol ready for some battle reports. What do you think of this colour? I love the typical Dark Eldar scheme where it's dark with quite bright highlights to give that ethereal colour, but I also really like colours that are quite bright or quite pale and just kind of go against that as well. As always, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the battle report next week. This is a re-upload of a video I put out ages ago under a different name. Basically, when I first signed up to Reddit or Discord or something, I chose the name Pagoda just on a whim because it's a fun word to say. Pagoda. 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 And then I just couldn't be asked to think of anything better when I started YouTube. But now I have the name I want, so I'm just re-uploading everything so it's not as confusing. Enjoy! Today I'm going to be painting some Eldar Guardians in my new vibrant pink colour scheme. Now the colours I'm using here are quite reminiscent of the craft world Altanzar, which isn't really an accident. I love the story of Altanzar and its figurehead Morgan Ra. When the Eldari Empire fell, Altanzar was far enough from the heart of the Empire to escape the initial shockwave. However, they were too close to the Eye of Terror and they weren't able to escape. There they suffered for 10,000 years, until Morgan Ra said enough was enough and went in to get them. He managed to rescue them, but since then the other Eldari treat them with suspicion. They feel like they must have been tainted by the chaos presence they were in. And it's sometimes said that they only speak to each other and only in hushed whispers. Honestly, it's so edgy, but like, whatever, it's 40k, you gotta go big or go home, right? I'm an emo anyway. Anyway, onto the painting. I started with a primer of Vallejo Grey surface primer, just through my airbrush here. We just want a nice bright base coat for the colours to go over. Now this may seem counterintuitive, but I promise there's a method here. We're going to base coat it with Vallejo Game Heavy Black Green. Now that's watered down, about 2 parts water to 1 part paint, so that's going to run into all those little crevices really well. You'll see here that I'm using an old brush. I just get a load of paint on and glob it straight on there, then move it around on the model. You can kind of wick bits back up as well. The main thing you want to be careful of is that you're getting things into all those crevices. You want a nice good shadow there, and this is our shadow colour, so just get that coverage, baby. This bit is simple but boring, so just get it done. As you can see there, some bits pool on the gun, but I just move it around, just keep wicking it back up, placing it on other parts of the models, and it's all good. Next we're going to do a zenithal prime. This is meant to simulate light hitting the top of the model and accentuating the kind of head, guns, protruding areas, things that you really want that to. So we're going to just dry brush any white and we're going to focus on the top. Any smaller, protruding or kind of detailed areas, what you want to do is brush kind of in a downwards motion. That way you'll catch all the paint to the top there and you'll give it that appearance that it's caught the sunlight. You can see here that I'm really focusing on the head, the backpack thing, the gun, just to make sure that all those areas really stand out as really bright. This is going to help us a lot in the next stage. Now it's finally time to add in some of our pink, and for that we're going to use Citadel Contrast Volupus Pink? Volupus Pink? Volupus. Anyway, we're watering that down with some contrast medium so that we get a real kind of clear light coverage. What that's going to do is leave a lot of the white there, and then it's also going to mix with some of that green. Now the reason we used green is that it's a contrasting colour. In a lot of other painting styles you'll see that they actually use colour to create the illusion of shadow, which is what I'm trying to do here. So this watered down is going to leave some of that green there. Sometimes the pink is going to pool and create a lot of a darker colour mixing with the green, and we're just going to get a lot of tonal variance there. So there you go, in my opinion that's already looking really cool. You've got so much like high tones and darks. We're going to try and go for like a non-metallic metal vibe. We're going to go for a lot of contrast on this. Anyway, now we're blocking in the dark grey / purpley area with Citadel Eshin Grey. Now I've mixed that about 1:1 with some contrast medium so that we just get some natural highlights and dark areas kind of forming there. So we're just going to block in the helmet, the shoulder pads, the chest plates and that barrel stock gun part thing. Next up, we're using Stonewall Grey by Game Colour. Now I've watered this down quite a bit because we've already dry brushed quite a lot of white onto there, and we want the weapons to be white anyway. So what we're using is this is more of a wash to just take away some of that green tones that we've got still in the gaps there. So we'll be blocking in the gun, equipment, faceplate, and of course the little wrist and ankle clip things. They're just cool details. I like those. Now this guy looks fine, but he could look better. Like, he's pink now, but he needs to be pink. So for that we're using Magenta Fluorescent by Model Colour. Now I wanted to try something a bit different here, so I'm glazing this on in a particular way. Instead of just going for like an edge highlight type thing, what I do is refer back to the model from about this angle and about this angle, then brighten up that pink anywhere that's like fully visible from those areas. What I want this to do is to add into that semi non-metallic metal feel and give it like a shimmery kind of look, like from certain angles it's catching the light. So I've watered this down quite heavily, so it's kind of almost like a glaze consistency, maybe a bit stronger than your typical glaze would be. But as you see here, I kind of go back and forth, allow bits to dry, just kind of like layer up that pink until I get a really nice consistency there. Now what I'm also doing here is I'm trying to avoid the edges because we've already got some nice edge highlighting from the fact that we used a contrast paint. Spoiler alert, I do go back and have to edge highlight anyway because I want it brighter. But really the good thing about contrast is that you get those established areas of highlight and shadow. So we try and work with it. Now in some instances I am painting areas that perhaps you can't see from the angles I showed, but that face that same general direction anyway. Basically, Eldar have a lot of curves that you really want to accentuate and make these models kind of pop. Oh, just look at it, getting so bright there. My main army at the moment is Necrons in a really grimdark style, so this has just been a complete break from that. This guy is going to look so good on the battlefield. He's going to be really well camouflaged if he ever has to fight in a highlighter factory. Now we're going to do a similar, kind of more toned down version of this on the grey purple bits. So what I'm using here is Game Air Alien Purple. The reason I'm using a paint for an airbrush here is because they have this quite thin consistency that works quite nicely as a glaze really. So if I have them I do tend to use them. Also I bought that one by accident once because I wasn't really paying attention in the shop. So got to get it used somehow really. Now as before we're using the same angles, we're creating that shimmery kind of effect. I've added a little bit of that purple into the head and the shoulders where we could see clearly from the angles we said before. Now we are edge highlighting, so using Model Colour's off-white, I'm just going to mix that about 50-50 with the fluorescent magenta that we were using before. So as you've probably heard before, you'd rather use the edge of your brush rather than the tip when edge highlighting. It just gives you a much cleaner line. Where that's not possible, the Eldar do have a few plates that kind of sit right next to each other rather than having corners. You really just want to wipe your brush clean of most of the paint so that it's not coming off in a uncontrolled kind of messy line. You really want to just get a nice neat line, as you can see here. One thing you can also do, as you see me do in the next shot, is come back in with the fluorescent magenta and just make that line a lot thinner there. It's actually quite a good habit to get into because you can really make those lines nice and crisp and neat there. Next up we're taking our off-white, we're using that pure and we're just going to touch those corners just very gently. Just add those highest high points. Now I decided the grey-purple area didn't have enough contrast yet, so I decided to use some Nuln oil, just wash that down there so we had some really deep dark shading. And this also helps just unify the black and the purple together there. So now we are edge highlighting the purple grey area. So what I did, I took a 1-1 mix of my off-white and my Esching grey. I just added like the slightest, just the tiniest touch of purple on my brush so that it had that tint to it, and then went along and edge highlighted. Then again, I took my pure off-white and just added it just to the very corners of the raised areas there. One thing I'd like to point out is that whenever you're painting, the paint always collects where you leave your brush. This is something that you'd use it when glazing quite a bit. However, you can also use it when edge highlighting. As you see here, I turned the chest plate upside down so that I'm pulling the paint up towards the top. And what that does is just give us a nice transition because the paint is strongest where the brush leaves the model. Of course, never forget the little clippy bits. While doing the white, I decided to take my off-white and do a dry brush over the weapon. I really wanted the white to come across as the main colour rather than just the highlight, and this has quite a lot of area, so I decided to dry brush that to get a bit of that gradient, and then I come back in with the brush and block out those areas that I really want to stand out. So finishing off with the eyes and the small details, which are going to be teal or a turquoisey colour. I really like that, and it's going to contrast nicely. So the easiest method I've found to do eyes, and the one that I can be bothered to do, is to fill it in with white first of all. Now you just want to like saturate that whole eye socket with white. As you can see there, it's a bit watered down, just so it'll flow into all the recesses of that eye, but it's still thick enough that it'll get a nice coverage there. So now I take game coloured turquoise and I'm painting the little armband. You can do more details here. This guy I'm leaving fairly simple, but sometimes they have those little stripes on the little back antenna things. Sometimes they might want details on the helmets, things like that. But this guy's just getting the armband. Now for the next part of this eye, we're going to really water down that turquoise and then just literally put it into the socket there. And what that'll do is that'll leave the white in the kind of middle part of the eye, whilst really saturating the outer area of the eye socket, and just give it this kind of cool glowy effect where you don't really need to worry too much about even highlighting it back up. So I finished basing it, and here's the final product. Hopefully you took from this video that you can experiment with colour as much as you like, and you got some slightly novel approaches to how you do your colours. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Ed, and I will see you in the next video. In my last painting video, I fully reimagined some of my old Drukhari models, stripping and repainting them. With the bases, I saw an opportunity to try a technique that I've been wanting to try for some time: marble-style tiling using dry baby wipe. Let's get into it. I wanted to try a variety of materials and techniques here, so I'll start with the tile material. I plan to use green stuff, milliput, and then a blend of the two that some people call grilliput. In the end, I didn't have enough green stuff to use that on its own, but it actually ended up working out okay, for reasons we'll come to later. Whichever material I was using, the method was the same. I took a small amount, rolled it into a ball, and then squished it onto the base. To get this as flat and smooth as possible, I used some greaseproof paper and a paintbrush as a rolling pin. The paper is smooth and doesn't stick, so it helps it to stay free of any texture. Now I started with the nearest brush I had to hand, which had a bit of a taper on it, and it took me a good few before I just decided a non-tapered cylinder would be much easier to use. I am not a smart man. After it was a thin, mostly even layer, I wanted to press it down hard with an even surface. I kept the paper and either pushed it against the table or sometimes used the side of this set square. I don't know why I changed the method up really, it made literally no difference, either was as good as the other. I guess I just got bored. Now I had a flat surface ready for the tile designs. Eldar always have these curved natural shapes, and Dark Eldar, Drukhari have that, plus lots of spikes and edges. So my first two tools were a straight and a curved thing to imprint with. I use a set square for straight and the rim of a base for curved. If this works well, I'll use different size bases so I have different angles of curve as well. I got this by cutting the base away with a super sharp knife, which at this point also solves the mystery of why I'm wearing a plaster in this video. Be careful with knives, people. Remember, I make these mistakes so you don't have to. So I got to carefully making shapes, keeping in mind that I needed a lot of narrow angles and spiky bits to get that evil look. At this point, I'd just like to mention, if you follow the link tree down below, you'll see my other socials. There's also a link to my Patreon and Ko-fi, where I'd massively appreciate if you feel it in your heart to give me any kind of support. It'll all go to helping improve the channel and the videos I make. Next, I went to my bits box for more ways to tie it into the faction. The Raider and Ravager kits have these shock prow kind of things. They have a raised Drukhari symbol on them, and there's a few different ones, so I thought these would be perfect to stamp into the tiles. I cut off the unneeded parts and then added the symbols where it would look good. I also took out this random blade bit from some vehicle sprue to use as a stamp. Finally, I used my knife to cut the excess off the edges of the bases. I went through each step for a single base, finishing before starting on the next. For the first few, I used milliput. This is easier to sand smooth once it's cured than green stuff is, but it can be difficult to get smooth sculpting results. It can kind of crack and has a weird texture sometimes. You also have to be careful because it's water soluble, so using that on tools can kind of disintegrate it a little bit. However, I do find it more usable for simple jobs with less sculpting, and I also use it when I can because it's cheaper. The next ones are done with a 50-50 mix. This combines the smoother sculpting ability of green stuff with being able to sand it of milliput. This is the mixture I preferred for this job, so going forward, this is the one I'll use. So good to try this out. I did want to try some with like quite a rough texture as well as some smooth ones. To do this, I bunched up some tin foil a few times to get it really wrinkled and then rolled it over the top, creating little rough divots and texture. On some bases, I kind of picked edges out and kind of pulled it apart a bit so it looked like the tiles had been damaged. I want it to look like wherever this place is has seen a terrible time using this and some later methods. I went through 10 test bases in this sitting and then left them to cure. Once the tiles cured, I needed to smooth the tiles to be fully flat, so I sanded them down with a sandpaper on a flat surface. This is where I realised the green stuff would have been more difficult anyway, as the stamping process will always push some material up and out, meaning it would have needed to be sanded. Green stuff just doesn't sand as smooth, it kind of gets a scratchy texture, so this worked out well. I also sanded the edges to look in line with the base. Right, so that's my basic tile design. There is more to go on top of the base, but the painting technique does need the surface to be flat, so they'll go on later. For my colour choice, I wanted to contrast the warm colour of my Drukhari, so I settled on Citadel, Sons of Horus Green, and Game Colour Turquoise. I primed them black and then wet blended, watering them down a bit so they get this kind of like cloudy look in with the black and the two different shades of green. I did this over several layers to build up the effect. Next we'll get to the main bit of the method. I took a dry baby wipe and teased it out, pulling it slowly apart to expand so that there were regular gaps in the strands. I pulled this taut over the base and then twisted it at the back so it was easier to hold and would stay still. With Pro-Acryl Bold Titanium White in the airbrush, I sprayed the base. If you try this, one big tip I can give is spray strictly from one fixed angle, i.e. directly above. If you try and get more area by varying in the angle of the base or moving the airbrush around it too much, it'll blur everything and just look messy where the paint's kind of come in around the fibres. I gave it a second to dry a bit and then carefully removed the baby wipe. You just need to remove it directly upwards and kind of peel it carefully so you don't slide it around the base, which would smudge the design. And it's that easy. They just look awesome like this. It took a little while to work out the consistency, because if you don't pull it apart enough, then you get barely any white on there. If you pull it apart too much, it's just a white base with like one blue line, so it definitely took a bit of back and forth. I followed this up with a watered down Drakenhof Nightshade wash and a very, very light dry brush with white to create further definition. I then used a gloss varnish on the smooth tiles. Before the other details, I used Storm Vermin Fur on the parts underneath the tiles where the little gaps were made. This is meant to look like some kind of like dirt or some kind of material underneath it. Now, to add in the further details, starting with some rocky rubble, I pre-painted this by simply mixing some basing sand in with Citadel Sea Grey. If you're going to try this, just add the paint in slowly and keep it moving as it dries. Just stir it in very slowly a bit at a time. If any bits attach as the paint dries, then just mix them until they come apart. I tried a different method for attaching these, arranging them first and then dropping thin PVA glue onto them. The surface tension of the water just kind of rearranged them, so this wasn't particularly worthwhile. Perhaps I'll try with isopropyl alcohol next time so there's no surface tension. I then put some PVA glue in between the tiles and the cracks and added some grass. Once these were done, I dropped more PVA glue over them to really bond them into place. Next, I tried this product I just got, Dirty Down Moss Effect. You put it on, then feather the edges with a brush or cotton bud. You can reactivate it with water so you can keep playing around with it. Overall, I ended up using too much because I was trying various methods, so in the future I'll keep it sparing. It kind of made it look like the marble was blue and green, in my opinion, rather than just little mossy patches. And here we see the idiot in his natural habitat. Having forgotten to shade the rubble before adding grass and moss, he carefully shades around those parts, trying not to mess the whole thing up, working hard not to cause a mess that would have been easily avoided if he'd just done this step first. So yeah, these rocks needed a quick shade, should have done that before the grass, completely forgot it. Finally, I took Blood for the Blood God by Citadel and made little blood puddles and spatters and stuff in a few places, just to show these Drukhari weren't slacking off. I filled in the rims with model colour Luftwaffe uniform and then I was done. So just to recap, if you follow this video along, shade the rubble before putting the other terrain bits down, then glaze the marble after sealing everything. Finally finish with the moss and blood at the end of that. Got it? Yeah, simple, right? So I already recorded this once, but I forgot to turn on the mic, so I'm just going to have to do it again. I've actually attached some Hellions to these now, so never mind. So, what do we think? I am not as much a fan of the rough texture. Marble is quite often in this nice smooth kind of thing, so it just looks nicer. I think I shaded and dry brushed it a bit much, so I've lost some of the details. So if you follow this along, like you can see there's still an okay amount, but you would want to make sure that stays looking very cool and marbly. For the moss, I definitely used too much because I was experimenting with it. It looks kind of like it just is a bit green, so in future I'll be using it a lot more sparingly. Most of the tile patterns I am fairly happy with, to be honest. This one maybe looks a bit... No, those shapes kind of look a bit Tyranid, kind of, because of like Tyranid spiky bits. But yeah, in general, I'll try and do more cohesive things with all the curves and stuff. The stamps were awesome. They're a bit like concave, so I'll probably file off these corners so that they work better next time. Using the set square as the straight bit made the gaps just a little bit too thick, so I will stick to using this in future. Definitely going to be chopping a few more base rims to vary that up. And this, it was fine. I probably won't bother using it again. Now, one thing I do really like is the grass coming up between the cracks. I think that looks really awesome, so I'll definitely do that. But yeah, generally I'll do a bit less detail on the base so the marble is left to stand out a bit more in future ones. And also I'm going to put a list on the screen now because obviously I was experimenting and I realised what order I'd like to do things in as I went. So yeah, it's probably, you're probably sitting there thinking I've got no idea how I'd do this. So as always, thank you for watching. I appreciate it if you like, subscribe, do all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next video. I've always been a fan of Eldar in all its forms. Craft World, Dark Eldar, Clown or Dinosaur. I just love me some space elves. So you can imagine my excitement last year when they got a refresh of their range. Obviously, the most exciting model was the Avatar of Cain, which I definitely would have made a video about if I hadn't got busy around that time. Well, now I'm back painting and making videos, and I wanted a big demon boy for my army, damn it. However, as we all saw more accounts painting an avatar than we could ever know what to do with, it seemed a bit redundant at this point. I've missed my chance to be one of the cool kids. Sad. Enter 3D printing, and I found this amazing model, the Cosmic Entity by Fantasy Cult Miniatures. This guy has an epic look to rival that of the Avatar, but without forcing you to sit through another video of one being painted. I had a fun plan for the majority of the armour of the model. I wanted to tackle that right at the end, so we'll talk a bit more about it then. So, I started with the crystals growing out from the dude and the sword, which I want to be like an icy blue, going full opposite to the flamey Avatar of Cain. I started by basing them with a 50-50 mix of Game Colour's ultramarine blue and just a basic black. I just watered this down and used a basic brush to lay it all down. Next I used ultramarine blue on its own. I took advantage of the nice shapes by dry brushing over these. This was quite a heavy layer as I only wanted the dark in the deepest parts. I also focused towards the ends as I want them to get lighter as they move away from its skin. These wide, round brushes are amazing. I'd recommend trying them if you haven't before. So dry brushing is a quick method, and I was able to move straight on to Citadel's Lothan Blue. Keeping the bristles very slightly moist as you go means that the paint won't actually dry on the bristles, so you can keep moving paints and then only give it a good, solid clean right at the end. I then did the exact same thing with model colour Sky Blue, now focusing on mostly the highest areas and the edges of the longer crystals. On the sword I'm focusing further and further to the end, but also trying to hit the edge of the jagged blade thing that he has. I finished this section with model colour Off-White. For this part I made sure to get rid of almost all the paint, so I only caught the very ends. I plan to touch up every part at the end, so for now this part's done. After that I handled all the parts with the musculature and between armour bits. I used Citadel's Basilicanum Grey for this. These are parts I don't need to draw attention to as there's plenty of other vibrant and colourful things going on. So I start with a simple contrast and then highlight with some Game Colour Stonewall Grey. Then I pick out the highest details with Off-White. These are watered down quite a bit so they don't fully cover, and done in just a quick sketchy way to establish the basic scheme. Using Game Colour Warlord Purple, I base coat the hair and sash. This one is to tie it all into the rest of my Eldar. I water this down quite a lot and use 2 coats just to make sure I don't lose any hair detail. Next, I shade these with Citadel's Caraberg Crimson. I get quite a lot of this on my brush and then glob it onto the model and then kind of use the brush to move it around, being careful to wick off any excess from areas that might start pooling. I re-establish the Warlock Purple again, leaving the shade in the recesses. Using model colour Fluorescent Magenta, I then go and add more highlights. For the cloth I focus on edges, flat areas and towards the bottom. And for the hair I just pick certain spots to highlight more so that the hair appears shimmery. Then I mix in some off-white for stronger highlights, following the same process as the last step. I use a solid black for the cloak at the back. I simply thin this down a little and cover the entire cloak. I highlight using Citadel's Eshin Grey, picking out all the folds and edges. I watered this down quite a lot so I could take it as a kind of glaze, changing the colour very little on each pass. The reason for this is that it can be quite easy to highlight black until it looks like grey, so I just wanted to avoid this. Onto the gems, and these are surprisingly easy to get a really nice effect on. I based these with Game Extra Opaque Heavy Black Green. I carefully went around picking out all of these, including the ones on the sword. I watered it down enough for it to run into the recesses, and this helped provide some definition before any layering had gone on. So onto this method. In case you've never painted gems before, the easy way to do it is highlight opposite to the rest of the model. This is because the glass kind of allows light to pass through but then bounces and refracts most at the bottom. So I take Game Colours Turquoise and highlight all the gems in the bottom 2/3. Next I use Model Colour Sky Blue and highlight a kind of crescent shape into the bottom third. Finally, using a pure white, barely even watered down, I add a glimmer to the tops of the gems. This is done with just a simple dot or two along the top. I also add a lower glimmer to some of the larger gems just to make them appear a bit more vibrant and sparkly. Right, finally, all that's left is the armour, and I'd like to get some definition before putting my colours on. So I take Citadel's Drakenhof Nightshade and put targeted bits into the cracks and lines between the panels. As I'm doing this before highlights, I don't need to be too neat over the grey base coat. I start the main colour by using my pure white to colour the armour. I water this down a lot as white is well known for looking lumpy or like chalky if you're not careful. Also, I don't really need it the full on white right now. Although I follow all the steps after this, I stop at the head, shoulder and chest to make sure I'm happy with the effect I want to achieve before wasting all my time across the entire model. So, onto the effect. As I was trying to decide what kind of scheme I was going to use for this, a video dropped by Rogue Hobbies where Louise painted a Rainbow Warrior Space Marine. In that she did a prismatic power sword and it just looked amazing. So I had to try it in much larger fashion obviously. So I start with Squid Pink, and as it's a glaze I use the gamer version. This is meant to be used through an airbrush so it starts out quite thin, and I always find them quite useful for getting a glaze because they start pre-thinned for you. Without much rhyme or reason, for each surface I picked one end to slowly glaze with the pink. Where edges meet, I tried to do the colour on opposite ends. So in case you haven't used this technique before, glazing is done with paint so thinned that it only tints the colour with each pass. It's always best to end the brushstroke where the colour will be strongest, as this is where the most paint will sit. Ideally you want layers so thin that they dry almost instantly, then you can build layers fairly quickly and you get a nice smooth effect. I use my sky blue in the exact same way, glazing colour on the opposite ends of each edge. Then, to shift the blue into a green, I used Demonic Yellow by Army Painter. This was glazed in the same way over the blue. Because I was going back and forth on this, it was really useful to have these out on my wet palette. If you've never tried one of these, I would definitely recommend giving it a go. They're really useful for keeping your paints really thinned and just there ready to go. So sometimes it would look more stripy than a prismatic colour shift, so I'd glaze back down to a white and try the colours somewhere else. To carry on making sure I like the full effect, I went to edge highlighting with pure white. I used this minimally thinned because I wanted it to look bright and bold. I did all the edge highlighting and those awesome little crack details. Once I'd got this finished and I was happy this was the direction I wanted to go, I went back through those steps for all the other armour. And let me tell you, this was a huge leap to go from one sword to an entire massive mini like this. After hours of glazing, I was kind of regretting my life choices. Was it worth it in the end? You decide. So now I was happy with the mini overall, I just wanted to do some touch-ups. I started with Lothan Blue and glazed it over with the sword and crystals to add some of that blue back in. Then I took my white and added some stronger highlight to those areas. These two steps really made the crystals pop. I was quite happy with that. Then I decided to smooth the lines in the grey musculature, so I watered down Stonewall Grey into almost a glaze consistency and slowly built up transitions between the light and dark areas of the muscle. Any areas that I felt ended up too light, I used Eshin Grey in the same way, bringing the tones back down. On the hair, I went back to the fluorescent magenta and dry brushed it back over the white, as I kind of felt I'd used a bit too much white and it was making the hair look too pale and desaturated. I was happy with the model at this point, so just needed to do the base. Here I wanted to keep the cool palette, so I picked Citadel Genestealer Purple and Fantasy Game Joralden Turquoise. After laying down some purple, I quickly added the turquoise and mixed them together on the Mini. This is a very rough version of wet blending. Where paint had already dried, I just added more in so I could mix between the two colours and create the gradients. Later steps would mean it didn't matter too much if this looked messy, and it did. Next, I took Citadel Fulgrim Pink and used a heavy but targeted dry brush. I decided to take this up to the attachment points on the cloth and feet so it would look like the energy was kind of lighting those areas. Then I went back to my pure white again and dry brushed on a smaller area. I tried to make them solid but narrow areas, creating the illusion that this is like a beam of energy. To neaten this up, I used a normal brush afterwards and painted on where I wanted it to look like the energy was brightest, creating kind of tendrils of energy. Finally, I used the same scheme on this as I used for the rest of my Eldar's base. I base coated it with Game Colour's Beastly Brown and washed it with Agrak's Earthshade. Instead of highlighting it with a lighter brown, I went back to Fulgrim Pink with a brief dry brush to give the appearance that the ground was being lit by the same energy. So there we go. Because of my short attention span, I generally try and use speed painting methods, stuff like slap chop and just zenithal highlighting and contrast. But with this model I kind of wanted to use more classic techniques and get some cool effects. I do think the prismatic effect came out really well and I can't wait to use this in a game. In the arenas of Commorragh is the greatest gladiator to ever live, Lilith Hesperax. She's a long-standing character of the Drukhari army and just such a badass. However, this is not that mini. I wanted to venture outside the standard stuff and found this beautiful mini by Aeldar, Supreme Gladiatrix Mavia. Aeldar have a variety of high-quality minis that I am desperate to paint, so you may see more of them in this channel, especially the Aspect Warriors GW just can't be asked to look at. Side note, this video is not sponsored by them, although I wouldn't say no to them, I just love the minis. Sponsor subliminal. Ooh, sneaky. As this is a minimal but important model, I wanted to get some more involved techniques to get some cool skin and armour effects. Let's get right into it. To get the colours how I want them, I start with a white prime. No zenithal, no slap chop. Yeah, that's how you know it's serious. Instead of doing all the base coats, then all the shades, then all the highlights, I'm going to go area by area, finishing each in turn. And I'm going to start with the skin. To get the super pale and unnatural look, I base coat with Ulthuan Grey. This is barely darker than a white, but just adds that pale, cold grey, very bluish. As with any base coat, I water this down slightly and apply 2 coats to get a good coverage. Now I use a weird colour because I really want to push the effect of bad health these people have. Deathguard Green is heavily watered down and then specifically applied to areas that would be in shade. This is apparently what the heavy metal painters do, so they keep the colour of the base coat accurate, rather than washing it all over, which would darken the whole surface. It works kind of like a glaze, and this means you want thin layers. Too much paint will pool and create those tide marks, so move the paint where you want it, make sure to mop up any excess, and do a few layers if needed. Because I'm using a third-party mini and I have my own custom cabal, I thought it'd be good to give this lady her own lore. In their long history, the Drukhari have been known to blink suns out of existence to be used in the webway. In the subdimension named Solnets, a stolen sun is housed and mined for energy. The Drukhari live in vast orbital palaces, while the ancient denizens scurry about in extra-dimensional caves underneath the surface of the sun. When the latest steward, Furevan Beyer, arrived, it was business as usual. Keep the denizens in check, enslave where necessary, and ensure the realm keeps up its energy exports. Okay, that was fine for basic values, but I do need to shade the hard lines where creases or where another surface overlaps. I use scale colour violet in a similar manner, but this time I'm really careful to only put it in those areas I just mentioned. Here I'm just creating a line between surfaces, not really shading within each surface. At this point, I'd just like to mention I also have a Patreon and a Ko-fi and an Instagram. All the links are down below. I really appreciate any support you can give me on any other platforms. Next, I re-established the base tone by going over the large surfaces with it. There has been some pooling where I wasn't careful enough, so here I can fix it. Now I grab bold titanium white and highlight the highest parts and edges. I try and use this sparingly as I don't want it to be too bright. However, I am going for this almost dead, kind of ghostly skin tones, so I need it to be white at the highest points. Next, the hair. I based this with Sons of Horus green, as my other Drukhari have a cool grey hair tone and I wanted just a bit more colour in this while keeping it kind of desaturated. After the 2 thin coats of base toner down, I use the contrast glazing technique. I want the hair to get progressively lighter as it travels out away from the head, so what I do is take shyish purple and then thin it heavily with contrast medium. Then, as if I was glazing, I paint multiple passes, doing less area each time. The result is that the green is darker towards the top and contrast has settled more in the recesses, creating shading. Why purple to shade green, you ask? I don't know, I had it to hand and it seemed cool. The ancient Eldari native to this realm never made it easy for their subjugators. Mining operations were made extra treacherous by random attacks, and Furavan Bear wanted to put a stop to that. He descended to the caves with his incubi and tore through the wretches. That is, until they came across a ragged woman. I decided to use the same technique with Basilicanum Grey on the bottom end, shading without going as dark or saturated. I get some Sons of Horus Green and some Ulthuan Grey ready. Then I start by dry brushing just Sons of Horus Green onto the upper hair area. As I move down, I add in more grey to the highlight, getting the effect of the colour shifting more pale grey further down. I keep adding in more as I go until I get right to the bottom where I'm highlighting with pure Ulthuan Grey. I also go back and do a bit of Ulthuan Grey around the top where it would have caught the light. As the seasoned warriors struggled to keep up with her, one was slain with a single potent strike of a dagger. The feral Aeldari stood over her prize as the remaining warriors retreated. For many cycles after that, the locals were empowered and the Kabbalite soldiers feared to police them, as the legend of the Hornet spread. It was said she could end any warrior with just a single sting. Okay, let's get the little clothing available on this lady. Most of her bodysuit parts will be black, but I base coat them with a 50-50 mix of black and burnt brown red. This is because I want them to be kind of leathery and warm looking. The whole vibe of my Drukhari is that their uniforms are warm, vibrant colours and their skin is cold and dead. I break the process of finishing one surface entirely here, as I want to make sure the colours I've chosen work together. With a name like the Hornet, she of course has a black and yellow scheme. So I use game colour Sun Yellow on the parts I picked out for that colour. Next I use Black Templar contrast paint as a shade for the leather. I knew this wouldn't have a huge impact as it was quite dark already, but it was worth doing anyway. Then I watered down the burnt brown red to highlight those areas. Now to add some highlighting for the hard black elements on the Mini. For the knives and black armour panels I highlighted with Eshin Grey. I don't worry about being too specific on this part, as I plan to do edge highlighting with kind of raggedy silver so it looks a bit damaged. Let's get on to that part. As always with the tedious edge highlighting, I get some paint on the brush then run the side of the brush along the edges and corners. On a lot of parts I did it in a kind of scratchy way so that it looked rough and damaged. In a few places I went over a few times just to make sure there was enough. But remember, if you do too much it'll look like it's just silver instead of damaged black, so go easy. Bayer had learned a hard lesson and now bucked the trend that his predecessors had set. He decided to parley with the Hornet and reward her skill rather than punish her crimes. He descended once again, this time with a white flag, showing humility that would have disgusted his peers. Now I want to shade the yellow parts, so I use game colour Orange Fire in the same method as before. I thin it substantially and paint it directly onto the areas that will be shaded. Again, some deeper areas require another coat or two to get it looking right. The gamble paid off, and the Hornet became one of Archon Bear's inner circle and most feared generals. As with the skin, I want to get a solid definition between surfaces, so I use Carroburg Crimson to make areas stand apart from each other. I then re-establish the base tone, painting it back onto any surface that needs it. Finally, to highlight, and for this I use model colour Ice Yellow. I do the edges and the sticking out parts of the belt. After inducting the Hornet into the ranks of the Cabal of the Poisoned Sun, the merging between the Drukhari and the denizens of Solnit proved fruitful. More skilled warriors revealed themselves and joined the effort, allowing the Cabal and the Cult of the Vicious Sting to prosper. Finally, for the yellow, we need to mess it up a bit. I grab my Rhinox hide and start edge highlighting again, putting it down in scratchy, rough, uneven patterns. Finally, on the larger areas, I go back with a little bit of silver to make it look scratched down to the base metal. I want the leather to look quite distressed too, so I start with a scratchy highlight with red leather, quite watered down. I do this in multiple passes, always using the scratchy marks. I apply this all over, then use basic skin tone on more selective areas. I focus on the edges and most upward facing areas. After this, I realised the leather was looking a bit too brown and I'd need to darken it down a bit. I wanted to glaze it back down, but before this I added another layer of the scratchiness with bone white that would show through the glazes better. So I thinned down Black Templar again and glazed it over a couple of times until I was happy the leather would read as black. Finally, I added more bone white as scratchy edge highlights. With the main stuff done, it was time for some touch-ups. There were a few areas the skin had got other paint on it, so I took my white and cleaned up those areas. I then felt the skin could do with just a slight bit more definition. I thinned down Shyish Purple with contrast medium again, and got to glazing it in any recesses and downward facing areas. This was done as a glaze, again moving onto another area, then going back round, adding more layers and more layers once the previous ones had dried. Then I moved on to the hair hooks and base coated them black. As these were small details, I didn't bother with too much, just an edge highlight of silver. With the mini done, I put some grey cere on the base. I dry brushed it white and shaded with Drakenhof Nightshade before painting the marble effect on. The Hornet claims to have been born with her legend, and to this day none amongst the Drukhari know her previous name. So there we are, the Hornet leading a pack of her witches into battle. What do you think of this? It's actually quite satisfying spending a bit longer on a mini doing all these like manual painting techniques rather than the speed paint style things. Let me know if you'd like to see more of this or if you prefer the speed paints, and maybe I'll paint another leader type unit in the future. Thanks for watching. Alright, and welcome back to Don't Think Just Charge. My name's Ed, and let's paint up a Phoenix Lord. Okay, let's address the flaming axe-wielding elephant in the room. This isn't actually official Fuegan, I lied to you. I recently got in contact with ArtLW, who make these awesome proxy minis for Eldar, Drukhari, Orc and Imperium, amongst loads of random one-off models. In particular, the primes of their Starborn Exiles faction are just absolutely amazing. So with the announcement of Fuegan, and since I started making this video basically every other Phoenix Lord, sorry Karandras, I thought it would be cool to show off some alternatives. Well, thank you to ArtLW, as they sent over the Fire Drake Prime to make a video on. A quick plug here, if you like any of these minis then check out the link below. It's an affiliate link, which means using it is going to give me a small commission for no extra cost to you. If you don't want to, it still massively helps if you could just like and subscribe, also leave a comment and they'll know you liked it and maybe they'll send me out more. I could do a whole Phoenix Lord series, so let me know if you want to see that. Right then, okay, all that rambling and bullshit out of the way, let's talk colour choices. I think it's going to look interesting to have a dark blue in the recesses going up to a not so dark red. Kind of inspired by like flames having the blue part the hottest, also like burnt metal gets like blues and purples, but finally I think it as a recess colour will make that main red colouring just really pop. I'm thinking these colours here as a transition. However, at the end I'm going to try and tie it all together with a wash of very thinned Black Templar. This means I actually want much brighter, more saturated versions of these, especially for the blue, which will get most of the black shading. So, with that in mind, here are the new colours I went for. A lot of my regular painting tends to use the airbrush. It's a tool at my disposal that kind of makes it easy to get good coverage quickly. A lot of speed paint is really helped by it. However, since it's not available to everyone watching, let's go back to some more classic methods. I'm going to use dry brushing to get the main colouring for this guy. In case you don't know, dry brushing is where you remove most of the paint from the brush and quickly run it across the edges, so it only catches those. You can control how much paint you get in the Mini by controlling how heavily you push the brush in, how much paint there is, and simply by going over the same area multiple times. These domed brushes aren't strictly necessary, but if you've never tried one before, then I would suggest get one, give it a try, and you'll probably like how they work. Also, the absolute authority on dry brushing, Artist Opus, always says that you don't actually want the brush properly dry, contrary to the name. So use a little sponge with a drop of water squished in and don't rub the paint off on something super absorbent like kitchen towel and you get the paint running a lot more smoothly. Okay, as you can see, I've worked up from my initial blue to purple to red. I want a little bit of edge highlighting without actually having to do edge highlighting. So, I'm also going to add in some demon red on another much lighter pass. To get an edge highlight effect, it's important to mostly move the brush perpendicular to the details. This, combined with having very little paint, will ensure it only comes off on the most outward facing areas. I actually want the helmet to come up as even brighter, so I use orange fire in the same manner here, just hitting the helmet in a really sparse kind of way, hardly any paint coming off on that at all. Right, now for the second part of this technique that ties it all together. If you're ever not sure about a dry brush, hit it with a shade or contrast, even quite thinned down, and you won't be disappointed. If it's all one colour, then it's usually best to use the one you're going with. For example, if I'd done this all in reds, I would have used Flesh Tearer's Red to tie it all together. But in this case I'm using black because it's neutral and I've used a few weird tones here. I thinned down Black Templar with Express Medium, about 3 parts medium to 1 part of paint. After that, it's a well-known technique of just slop paint all over the Mini. Really important part here, once the initial layer is down, I'm going to go and get rid of all the excess that's left on the brush, and then I'm going to come back in and kind of move it around, making sure nothing is pooling too heavily, making sure you've got even coverage. Even with less on the Mini, it's still going to run, it just means it won't pool as much. After the first dry brush / wash pass, it's looking cool, but I think if I do another more targeted round, it's going to push up the effect even more. Remember, there are no set rules to this. If you can think of a way to push for the effect you imagined, just do it. So, back to a very light dry brush of the orange, and then even pushing into yellow for the very tips, followed by another Black Templar pass. I'm wondering if I'll get a bit more vibrancy on the helmet if I actually shade it with Flesh Tearer's Red. The jump from black shading to red is actually really obvious and it kind of throws it off a bit. So what I'll do is quickly blend in some more of the Black Templar mix so the shade kind of transitions a bit more slowly on the bottom of the helmet and the shoulders. Ah, look at that, it's as cool as I hoped it would be. Okay, let's move on to some other colours and we'll be able to see if it all kind of comes together well. My Craftworld Eldar have this kind of pale grey Wraithbone style equipment, so I'm going to keep to that. Ulthuan Grey is used in 2 thinned down coats to base coat all these parts I want. I then use Null Noil in a kind of specific way. This is a method I tend to think of in my head as glaze shading, and involves a targeted way of applying a shade. Basically, new Null Noil has way less pigment in it than its old formula, but this means it works quite well as a glaze. If you make sure your brush strokes move towards where you want the most build up and use a few layers, You can make the shading this really smooth and subtle colouring. As well as sitting in the recesses, you can also create highlight areas with your brush direction. Forcing the paint to settle more on the underside will give you some nice highlights at the top areas. Nard oil is known as liquid talent for a reason. You can just slop it over a mini and it's going to look awesome, but with these kind of simple additional ways of using it, you can make it look even better. Cool. Now let's do some turquoise. The main colour for my Eldar is pink, but I think that would clash here. So the turquoise and the darker purple will be my main secondaries. I use game colour turquoise on the cloak and a few other areas that look like they deserve it. Then it's more glaze shading with Drakenhof Nightshade. You can see where this method works well on parts like the knee pad, where I'm able to create nice kind of shading and transition to the dark areas just by controlling where the shade goes over a couple of layers. I'm not finished with the Drakenhof yet, but actually I want more purple than I was originally thinking. This cloak is just a tad boring all in this turquoise colour, so I'm going to add a load there. Also, those main parts between the armour panels will look good, a bit different from the main armour colour, so this will be good for those. Before returning to the shades, I'm going to base all the gems in orange. I think these need to be like fiery colour, but to take them down to that dark red would kind of just blend them in with the armour and they wouldn't stand out too much. So I think what I'm going to do is make these orange right up to a very bright yellow. Therefore, orange is a good one to start with as like the darker end of the gems. While I'm here basting, I'm going to do that skull on the belt. I started using Ushabti bone until I realised mine was basically almost dry, so then I did the second coat with Skeleton Legion. Now with all the main colours down, I can go back to Drakenhof. That purple is actually way too light, but instead of finding a darker tone and using that, I'm just going to spend all my time shading it down a load. Probably don't do that. I use the glaze shading method over multiple passes, getting more on the purples and in the lower parts of those cloak folds. As I finished off the gems, I based the axe and ammo part of the gun. To start a cool glowing effect, I'll water down Skulker Yellow and put it in the runes and panel lines of these parts. Talking of cool effects, that gun looked like it could do with kind of a burnt up barrel. I used Basilicanum Grey with a dry brush because they're wider and firmer, and just kind of stipple it on to create an uneven gradient. It also settles a bit more strongly in the shade areas because this is a contrast paint. Alright, things are looking pretty cool with all the colours down, so it's time to go and neaten stuff up. Back to Ulthuan Grey and Turquoise, and I'm going to block out the areas that shouldn't have any shading. Then a bit of edge highlighting, even though I tried to escape all that shit. I use sky blue for the turquoise parts and white star for the grey. While I'm doing all the fiddly stuff, let's get the gems done. The basics of colouring gems are that you want the dark part on the top and light part on the bottom, conversely to normal because the light is travelling through the glass. Then to represent the reflective light, you do just a little dot on top and it makes it look like that light is kind of bouncing off and travelling through. Looks really cool there. So I highlight up with Skulky Yellow and then Ice Yellow progressively lower down in the gem, then White Star just to add that little reflective highlight. Now I'm going to get a cool Bernie effect on the axe and ammo pack. I start with Sanguine Scarlet and do a kind of messy stipple dry brush. I'm making sure to do the opposite of a regular dry brush here, using enough paint to leave an obvious texture. I focus it on the edges of the blade and kind of build it up slowly, then move on to burnt brown red and do the same. I use a smaller brush that I cut and messed up specifically for these types of jobs here, to be more concise with where the paint ends up. And that's the paint job. I did a few more neatening things off screen, like the eyes, because they were just so fiddly to do with the camera in my face. Apart from that, it was all repeats of previous steps, just a little bit more like shading and edge highlighting, a quick job on the base, and this is the end result. There we go then. The blue, purple, red thing I did at the start maybe could have been left a bit more obvious. You can only really slightly see the blue tones in one or two places, but overall I'm very happy with this guy as my Fuegan. If you watched this far then thank you so much. A Phoenix Lord is on their way to let you try on their armour right now. As I said at the start, let me know if you'd like to see like a little series of these Phoenix Lords and I'll see if we can set that up with ArtLW. Also, links below, go check out their stuff, it's really awesome, go buy some stuff from my affiliate links. Okay, bye! Alright, and welcome back to Don't Think Just Charge. So, Kill Team looks pretty fun. While I'm not generally covering much Games Workshop, it's not like I'm categorically against them. I love 40k and old world lore, they still for the most part have some of the best minis out there, and occasionally they come up with a game that isn't unnecessarily bloated with clunky, unbalanced rules. So I went splitsies with my friend Rye for the Salvation box set. I got some Scorpions and he got some Scouts and we both got super pumped to try it out. So let's get painting. So for colour choice, as always I have to take into account that my craft world is a bright pink colour and I'm going to include a lot of that on this. So what I've been doing with my Aspect Warriors is giving them a slightly more muted version of the regular colour schemes, and these guys will be no different. I'm going to try for a dark bluey green instead of the warm one. If the usual ones are like hiding in forest colours, then I guess these ones are like a forest at night or something. As with the last painting video, I'm going to avoid the airbrush and focus on dry brushing and glaze shading. From a very dark blue base tone, I'm going to jump up quite quickly in colours with Pro Acryl's bright pale green. This is quite a heavy dry brush, so I don't need to remove that much from the brush. Every bit of the armour is hit with a heavy pass so that it's mostly light green with just some blue in the recesses. Next I use Ice Yellow to get a higher, brighter tone. This change in colour temperature is going to make it stick out to the eye and have some interest. As this is more for some kind of highlighting and some quick edge highlighting, there's less paint on the brush, so it's only grabbing the edges and corners. At this point I'm also trying to kind of create a bit of volumetric highlighting. This is where you highlight based on the overall shape of a section, so you're kind of accentuating that and drawing attention to the shape. So basically, I usually move my brush from a top-down angle, or if it's on the top I'll do it a bit heavier, and I focus on areas like the head and shoulders, basically where I'm trying to draw some focus. Right, it's looking okay, but not too interesting, so let's add that in. Firstly, let's increase the green tones a little with Bale Tan Green Wash. This is part of what I've been calling the glaze shading process, and basically just means that instead of slopping the wash on, we focus it to areas we want more affected. This mostly means paying attention to where we move our brush, because more is deposited where the brush leaves the mini and less is deposited at the start of the brush stroke. If we start at the top and then move downwards or towards recesses, that's where the wash is going to settle. We can also move the wash around to settle more in the armour gaps and areas that would be shaded. Nice, that's added some vivid green into the mix and looks pretty cool I think. Now I want to make the armour appear even darker by doing a similar pass but with Drakenhof Nightshade. This is much more conservative, only in areas that the light really wouldn't reach and in the lines between panels. Using green then yellow to highlight and blue to shade it down in my opinion creates some awesome visual interest. It's not just dark green up to light green, the different hues kind of make it pop. Just to mention now that the channel is growing quite nicely and I'd love to make 2025 just a really cool year for it. So if you're enjoying, I'd just be so thrilled if you'd comment, like, subscribe, share to your reptilian overlords, all that jazz. As with all of my Eldar, the guns and more mechanical looking bits are going to be a pale grey. I use Ulthuan grey thinned down to base coat these. While it's out I'm also going to get anything that needs to be pink. Because I'm going to do a bit of a cheat with contrast paints, I need to start from a pure white, so why not do a layer with light grey while it's out. While filling in other base colours, I'll do the turquoise. This is more of a spot colour on my army, just to pick out some cool details, and in this case I put it on the armour embellishments on the Exarch, the squad leader of the group. Finally, the purple areas are filled in with scale colour violet. Doomfire Magenta is like my favourite thing, especially through an airbrush, it's just amazing. In this case I just paint it on the old fashioned way and let it do its contrast thing. Remember, to get a good use out of contrast, you want to put a decent amount on so it can freely run, but then wipe your brush off and kind of suck up some of the excess from the mini, then you'll get that cool shading without any tide marks or excessive pooling. Now all the colours are down, I go back to glaze shading with null oil on all the light greys. The newer formula is so weak you can use multiple passes to get some super smooth shades with this. The same technique is done again with Drakenhof Nightshade on the pink and purple. I'm a bit more careful on the pink as I don't want to shade it down too much and lose that bright magenta kind of look, so I only apply it to the deep recesses and the very downward facing areas. All these areas just need highlighting up now, so for the greys I go back to Ulthuan Grey to establish the colours where they should be, then white for edge highlighting. For the purples I re-establish the violet, then edge highlight with 2 thin coats Sorcerer's Cloak and hot pink. For the pink I just mix a bit of White Star into Doomfire Magenta, and finally for the turquoise I re-establish the turquoise and then highlight with Ice Blue. I also go back to the Ice Yellow for the tiniest little dots and corners of the main armour. Normally the edge highlighting part of the video is accompanied by some comment about how I hate it, but to be honest, I'm kind of just used to it now and even kind of enjoy it sometimes. Let's talk about why I do it and why you might want to or you might feel you don't need to. Since I'm painting minis for tutorials and battle reports, I feel there's always going to be like a high level of detail shown. For the same reason that GW box art has like everything edge highlighted, including parts that shouldn't be, the edge highlighting kind of allows the eye to read the mini really easily and quickly in close-ups. This is the main reason I put time into it rather than a quick like kind of cheaty dry brush edge highlight, and probably the reason you'll see most other YouTubers do it too. I've played with so many people who use a contrast and wash or some other speed paint technique and don't even think about edge highlighting, and the army looks fantastic. If you're simply playing with them and not shoving cameras all up in their faces, don't feel too precious about defining every gap and edge. Okay, TED talk over, let's do some finishing touches. I wanted to add a little pop of some warm colours because most of the mini is looking quite cold at the moment. So the gems are going to be a reddish orange. I start with Asmodeus Red as a base, and then Hellspawn Red, Fire Orange and Skulker Yellow in smaller and smaller areas on the gems. The highlights here go lower down, conversely to usual highlights, as it represents the light travelling through the glassy substance. Finally, a dot of white is added at the top for the bit of light that has just bounced off that reflective surface. The last detail is all the little mountings for the gems along with some of the other little thin details. These are so small that I know I'd probably just accidentally cover over them with another step, so now I can do them as the last thing. With that, the stealthy boys just need to be put on their bases and we are done. There we go then, another unit for the craft world and a step towards kill team. If you've played before, what do you think I should use? Blades of Cain can use Scorpions, Avengers and Banshees, but they get bonuses if they use all of one rather than mixing, so I'm kind of debating whether I go pure Scorpions or add in some of the other ones as well. If you watch this far then, you rock. This dude is coming to shake your hand. Right then, bye.